Welcome to Shenanigans in SCHOW with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. I'm Mary SanGiovanni, and you know that there will be shenanigans, and they will be cosmic. Welcome to part 2 of our coverage on the history of Weird Tales magazine. Today, we're going to talk about the more recent incarnations of Weird Tales. Writers, readers, fans, and friends of modern cosmic horror may remember that Weird Tales finally and lastingly resurrected at the end of the 1980s. This was accomplished by George H. Skithers, John Gregory Betancourt, and Darrell Schweitzer. They formed Terminus Publishing out of Philadelphia and licensed the rights from Robert Weinberg. Their business plan involved a focus on direct subscription over newsstand distribution. And as we talked about in part 1, a lot of Weird Tales history involved sort of revamping it and trying new ways to sell issues and to sell the content. Now, under these men, the first issue had a cover date of spring 1988. However, it was produced early enough to be available to the 1987 World Fantasy Convention in Nashville, Tennessee. So people got sort of a sneak preview. There were also limited edition hardcover versions of each issue signed by the contributors. So they were really looking at a new way to breathe new life into the Weird Tales magazine. The magazine received a special World Fantasy Award in 1992, acknowledging the quality of the content. However, as is historically the case, money was still an issue. And as so often had happened in the past, the format and the size were reconsidered. And, for example, as in the winter 1992-1993 issue. But the next couple of years saw the irregular publication of issues. The summer 1993 issue was the last to have a hardcover edition. They stopped doing it after that. And according to an online source, it was also the last for a while to have the name Weird Tales, as Weinberg did not renew the license. So this magazine, under these three gentlemen, was retitled Worlds of Fantasy and Horror, and the volume numbering was restarted Volume 1, Number 1. However, according to this source, in every other way the magazine was unchanged, and the 4 issues under this title, issued between 1994 and 1996, are regarded by bibliographers as part of the overall Weird Tales run. Now here's something I definitely didn't know and I thought was pretty fascinating. Although this series was never made, HBO announced in April of 1995 their plans to turn Weird Tales into a 3-episode anthology show similar to Tales from the Crypt. Screenwriters Mark Patrick Carducci and Peter Atkins facilitated this deal, and directors Tim Burton, Francis Ford Coppola, and Oliver Stone were executive producers, with each one expected to direct an episode. Stone was to be the director of the pilot. However, it didn't work out, and the series was never made. There were no issues of the magazine in 1997. But in 1998, Skithers and Schweitzer negotiated a deal with Warren Lepine of DNA Publications, which allowed them to start publishing Weird Tales under license once again. So Weird Tales, woohoo! It's back! The first issue was dated summer 1998. And other than the omission of the winter 1998 issue, a regular quarterly schedule was maintained for the next 4.5 years, so they're back on schedule, back on track. Sales, however, continued to be weak. So, Wildside Press, owned by John Betancourt, joined DNA and Terminus Publishing as co-publisher, starting with the July-August 2003 issue, and Weird Tales again returned to a mostly regular schedule. There was, following this, a long hiatus which ended with the December 2004 issue, and that appeared in early 2005. That was the last issue under DNA. Wildside Press then bought Weird Tales, and Betancourt joined Skithers and Schweitzer as co-editor. The first Wildside Press edition appeared in September of 2005. The subsequent issue, February 2006, marked a steady bi-monthly schedule for quite some time. Now, as has happened in the past, in early 2007, Wildside announced a revamp of Weird Tales, naming Stephen H. Siegel the editorial and creative director, and later recruiting Ann Vandermeer as the new fiction editor. Now, it's my opinion that under Vandermeer, the magazine saw new life, new creativity, and genuine quality. It was original weird fiction, and I very much was looking forward to seeing the direction that Vandermeer was going to take the magazine. However, in January... Still in January 2010, Siegel traded the top position at Weird Tales for a senior contributing editor position, because he was also taking on an editorial position at Quirk Books. Vandermeer was elevated to editor-in-chief, and Mary Robinette Cowell joined as art director. On August 23rd, 2011, John Betancourt announced that Wildside Press would be selling Weird Tales to Marvin Kaye and John Harlocker of Nth Dimension Media. Marvin Kaye took over chief editorial duties, and with issue 359, the first under the new publishers, this issue was published in late February 2012. Now, Weird Tales has always been somewhat connected to, again, if there's, sales issues, sometimes there were publishing issues. According to online sources, as of April 2018, the most recent issue to appear was dated spring 2014. In between this time, Ann Vandermeer stepped down because of the publication of a serial which many people deem to be chock full of racist undertones. And although the Weird Tales ultimately decided not to publish this particular serial, Ann Vandermeer had moved on to other editorial opportunities. Now, the Wikipedia page on Weird Tales claims that Harlocker continues to sell 4-issue subscriptions to Weird Tales, but that there are no updates provided on the magazine's website regarding development of future issues of the magazine. Now, when I went to the website, I haven't been able to find any place where Harlocker is doing this. When I went to the Weird Tales website, there appears to be 3 pieces of art simply titled The Undead Issue, and there's no other information on the Weird Tales website about it. There is a current and active Weird Tales Facebook page, but a quick scroll through doesn't show anything about future issues. Its company overview on the Facebook page states that Weird Tales has enjoyed a devoted following for many decades as the very first magazine of fantasy, horror, and science fiction. Founded in 1923, Weird Tales introduced the world to such counterculture icons as Cthulhu, the alien monster god, and Conan the Barbarian. The magazine's influence extends through countless areas of pop culture, fiction certainly, but also rock music, goth style, comic books, gaming. Even Stephen King has called Weird Tales a major inspiration, end quote. So, that's essentially the history of Weird Tales. But there is some interesting trivia that I thought, in researching for this show, about Weird Tales and the people involved in it and connected to it. As I mentioned before, Henneberger founded the magazine primarily to give a place for these kinds of stories to be published. People like Harlan Ellison were saying that a lot of magazines wouldn't take the kind of content that Weird Tales eventually ended up publishing. And he has quoted Henneberger as stating, "I must confess that the main motive in establishing Weird Tales was to give the writer free rein to express his innermost feelings in a manner befitting great literature." And that's what he did. There were a number of absolutely seminal authors whose literature, their writing is considered great horror and fantasy literature. another interesting aspect. Edwin Baird, he was the first editor of Weird Tales. He disliked horror stories. His expertise was in crime fiction, and most of the material he acquired for Weird Tales was considered bland and unoriginal, because he didn't like the horror. The magazine published mostly traditional ghost fiction, with many of the stories narrated by characters in lunatic asylums or told in diary format. I think that that's important in noting, because so much of cosmic horror, traditionally, two major elements of cosmic horror throughout its history have been themes of insanity and this epistolary format, or diary format, letter format, stories inside stories inside stories of written documentation. So I think it's interesting that probably Edwin Baird's dislike of horror, which led to a more, gothic ghost story sort of format, had that kind of influence on the style of cosmic horror, even then, that insanity and this epistolary format continued on to form a basis of a lot of cosmic horror stories. In the middle of the year that Baird was editor, he received 5 stories submitted by H.P. Lovecraft. And this I think is kind of interesting too. Baird bought all 5 of them. Now there is some question as to whether or not Baird was a huge supporter of Lovecraft or Henneberger was. There's some discrepancy there as to who actually really was a big fan of Lovecraft, even from Lovecraft himself. Lovecraft, though, had been persuaded by friends to submit his stories, and he included a cover letter that was so remarkably negative about the quality of his own work that Baird published it in the September of 23 issue. He published the cover letter with a note appended that said that he had bought the stories, quote, despite the foregoing or because of it. A note from writer to writer: don't talk about how bad your stories are to editors, because a lot of editors I don't think are going to take this view. But it is kind of interesting that Lovecraft's cover letter was one of the big things that they tell you not to do in writing. I think that's kind of funny. Baird insisted that the stories be resubmitted. This was his one issue with Lovecraft's submissions. He insisted that the stories be resubmitted as typed, double-spaced manuscripts, which is a standard of the business today. Now, Lovecraft disliked typing, so initially he decided to resubmit only one story, and that was Dagon. That appeared in the October 1923 issue, and I'm guessing that that's one of his shorter stories, that it was because it would have taken him less time to type it. It was the October 1923 issue was one of the most noteworthy of Baird's tenure, according to critics, since it included stories by 3 writers who would become frequent contributors to Weird Tales. As well as Lovecraft, it marked the first appearance in the magazine of Frank Owen and Seabury Quinn. Henneberger liked working with Lovecraft, and he had this idea. This is another interesting thing that I was not aware of. He had this idea where he contacted Harry Houdini, and he made arrangements to have Lovecraft ghostwrite a story for him using a plot supplied by Houdini. This story is Imprisoned with the Pharaohs, and it appeared under Houdini's name in the May, June, July 1924 issue. However, it was nearly lost, and I think a lot of writers can relate to this. Lovecraft left the typed manuscript on the train he took to New York to get married, and as a result, he had to spend much of his wedding day retyping the manuscript from the longhand copy he still had. I'm not going to lie, this sounds like something Brian Keene would do. In the May, June, July 1924 issue, it also included another story by Lovecraft under another name, The Loved Dead, a story by C.M. Eddy Jr. Now, I suspect that this was under a pseudonym because it included the mention of necrophilia. According to Eddy, this led to the magazine being removed from the newsstands in several cities. Now, although there has been some controversy as to whether or not this actually happened. Apparently, this rumor was verified by St. Joshi, that it did happen, that because of the mention of necrophilia, the issue was pulled. Now, the editors of Weird Tales, for the most part, never really had an issue with content. They wanted a platform where writers could sort of run free with ideas in fantasy and horror. And Weird Tales ended up being that platform. The editors of Weird Tales backed up their choices. They backed up this, although a lot of the covers were shocking and a lot of the content was shocking. Another interesting thing, speaking of Lovecraft, is that a lot of his work was initially rejected by Weird Tales before eventually being bought. Wright initially rejected The Call of Cthulhu. He eventually bought it and printed it in the February 1928 issue. On several occasions, he rejected Lovecraft's stories, only to reconsider them later. It's been suggested that Wright's rejection at the end of 1925 of Lovecraft's In the Vault, which is one of my favorite stories of his, a story about a mutilated corpse taking revenge on the Undertaker, who was responsible for his mutilation, was because it was too gruesome. But Wright changed his mind a few years later, and the story eventually appeared in April 1932. He also rejected Lovecraft's Through the Gates of the Silver Key in mid-1933. Price had revised the story before passing it to Wright. After Wright and Price discussed the story, Wright bought it in November of that year. However, Wright did turn down Lovecraft's novel At the Mountains of Madness in 1935. In this case, it was probably because of the story's length. By this point, running a serial required paying an author for material that would not appear until 2 or 3 issues later, and Weird Tales was having money issues at the time. In this case, he did not change his mind, and it ended up being another publisher that published At the Mountains of Madness. Wright did publish The Infidel's Daughter by Price, E. Hoffman Price. This was a satire of the Ku Klux Klan, and a lot of Ku Klux Klan members were angry. Wright got an angry letter and a canceled subscription from a Klan member, but E. Hoffman Price later recalled that Wright's response was, quote, "A story that arouses controversy is good for circulation. And anyway, it would be worth a reasonable loss to rap bigots of that caliber," end quote. So it's kind of nice that, he was poking at the racists even then. Now, Virgil Finlay, one of the most important figures in the history of science fiction and fantasy art, made his first sale to Wright in 1935. The covers of Weird Tales have always been an issue of discussion. There was a lot of nudity on these covers. And I'd like to note here, again, that most of the nude women covers of Weird Tales were done by a female artist. Okay? That was kind of her jam. That was what she was known for. She and Virgil Finlay did a lot of covers for Weird Tales over the course of the magazine's run. Virgil Finlay's first sale to Wright was in 1935. Wright only bought one interior illustration from Finlay at the time. He was concerned that Finlay's delicate technique would not produce well on pulp paper. However, there was a test print on pulp stock, and it demonstrated that the reproduction was going to work. It was going to be fine. So after that, Wright began to buy regularly from Finlay, and he became a regular cover artist for Weird Tales from the December 1935 issue on. Now, the 4 issues edited by Sam Moskowitz in the early 1970s, they were mostly notable for a detailed biography of William Hope Hodgson. This was serialized over 3 issues, along with some rare stories of Hodgson's that Moskowitz had unearthed. Many of the stories were reprints, either from Weird Tales or from other early pulps such as the Black Cat or the Blue Book. And again, I think this is notable because I believe that there was an effort throughout time, and I think it's one of the reasons why, despite all of the financial issues, all of the low sales or whatever, that Weird Tales has been such an enduring magazine and such a force in the business is because a lot of the editors, regardless of their backgrounds or their tastes, or a lot of the editors of Weird Tales went out of their way to find unique fiction, and that was Henneberger's whole point. He wanted the magazine subtitle had been for unique stories, and I think that this is true. I think a lot of people tried to hold to that ideal, that unique fiction, wide-ranging, original, groundbreaking stories were the way to go. And for that reason, I think that it's had such a lasting and enduring effect on the business. Despite that, okay, there was criticism, though. There was criticism of Lynn Carter's series for having, quote, too much reliance on the old names like Lovecraft, Howard, and Smith by reprinting mediocre material. New writers were not sufficiently encouraged, end quote. Now, I think that accusation has come up from time to time with Weird Tales. But as I just said, I think that partly it was because this magazine, its whole goal, its whole mission statement was to find new and original material. And I think that Weird Tales was held often to a higher standard in that regard. So that if it did rely on old standbys or, fiction from reliable sources that the editors were comfortable with working with, that opened it up to criticism. That there has been historically this belief that Weird Tales should be more forward-thinking and more diverse in its content. It was during this era, though, this Lynn Carter era, that new writers, and honestly, those who became the new staples, the new old names like Lovecraft, Howard, and Smith, this is when they first started appearing in Weird Tales. When I first started writing, those old names, those, absolute standbys of Weird Tales were Ramsey Campbell, Tanith Lee, and Steve Rasnick Tem. This is the era where they started getting published in Weird Tales. Now, the April-May, here's another interesting tidbit. The April-May 2007 edition featured the magazine's first all-new design in almost 75 years. During the next few years, Weird Tales published works by a wide range of strange fiction authors. This included people like Michael Moorcock, Tanith Lee, Jay Lake, Kat Rambo, Rachel Swirsky, names that you probably recognize from science fiction and fantasy and horror today. It also included the addition of, that broader range of content, ranging from narrative essays to comics to features on weird culture. There was, again, that return, that attempt to make Weird Tales the magazine of the unusual. The magazine won its first Hugo Award in August of 2009 in the semi-prozine category. It got 2 Hugo Award nominations in subsequent years, and its first World Fantasy Award nomination for editors Siegel and Vandermeer in more than 17 years. So there was really a concerted effort to make Weird Tales, again, the magazine of the unusual, and I can applaud that. Now, in August of 2012, Weird Tales became involved in a media altercation. This was what I had alluded to earlier on. It became involved in this media altercation after the editor announced the magazine was going to publish an excerpt from Victoria Foyt's controversial novel, Save the Pearls. Okay, there was a lot of critics accused this novel of having racist stereotyping. And the decision was made despite the protests of Vandermeer. But this prompted her to enter association with the magazine, and I feel that that's unfortunate. I think under Vandermeer, Weird Tales would have seen probably an apex of success that it had not maybe seen prior. The publisher subsequently overruled the editor. It announced that Weird Tales no longer had plans to run the excerpt. But I do think that this was sort of an unfortunate incident in the history of Weird Tales, because I think it did have an impact overall on the magazine. Now, Robert Weinberg, despite his criticisms of Weird Tales content throughout time, very much, I think, was appreciative of the good work that Weird Tales did do in publishing some of the, giants of not just the cosmic horror field, but of science fiction, fantasy, and horror in general. He argues that much of the material Weird Tales published would never have appeared if the magazine had not existed. And I tend to think, from having done the research on this magazine, that's probably true. It was through Weird Tales that we got Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith. They became widely known from this magazine. And it was one of the first and most important markets for weird fiction and science fantasy artwork. There were a lot of the stories in this magazine adapted for early radio shows, such as Stay Tuned for Terror. The magazine's golden age, it is considered, was under Wright. And Sprague de Camp argues that one of Wright's accomplishments was to create, quote, a Weird Tales school of writing. Now, two editors, Justin Everett and Jeffrey H. Shanks, they had edited a scholarly collection of literary criticism focused on Weird Tales. And they argue that, quote, Weird Tales functioned as a nexus point in the development of speculative fiction from which emerged the modern genres of fantasy and horror. And as listeners of this podcast have probably noted, there is a pattern that seems to support this. There was a sort of funneling of different kinds of weird fiction, science fantasy, the romanticism stories, weird fiction in general, into Weird Tales as a vehicle for developing what we now think of as weird fiction, cosmic horror, okay? Which has a lot of, basically a combination of fantasy and horror elements. The magazine was, and this is unusual for a pulp magazine, it was included by the editors of the annual Year in Fiction anthologies and was generally regarded with more respect than most of the pulps. This remained true long after the magazine's first run ended. It became the go-to source of fantasy short stories for anthologists for several decades. And as we cataloged in both part 1 and part 2 of this show, a lot of the anthologies that editors were putting together in the 60s and 70s, they wanted to take from the content of Weird Tales. Again, Weinberg argues in his history of Weird Tales that the fantasy pulps, of which in his opinion Weird Tales was the most influential, helped to form the modern fantasy genre, and that Wright, quote, if he was not a perfect editor, was an extraordinary one, and one of the most influential figures in modern American fantasy fiction. He added that Weird Tales and its competitors served as the bedrock upon which much of modern fantasy rests. And at this time, by fantasy, they meant weird fiction in general, speculative fiction, fantasy, horror, science fiction. And I tend to think that's true. I believe that Weird Tales was absolutely instrumental in establishing the kind of fiction that, that really serves as a fundamental inspiration for all modern, not just modern cosmic horror, but modern horror and fantasy fiction as it is today. And the thing that I find most impressive about this, the thing that I find most endearing about this was that there was always, despite its problems, a real effort to do something different, to push the envelope, to really explore the boundaries of what could be done with this kind of fiction. I have long been of the belief, and on this show, we generally only talk about cosmic horror, but on this show, I think that I've gone to some length in supporting the idea that much can be done with cosmic horror and with science fiction and fantasy and horror in general, but there is something about cosmic horror that reaches for more things, that really explores the importance of the contributions of human beings, or the lack of importance. But the idea is that it really tries to look at the bigger picture, the bigger cosmic picture. And without Weird Tales, we wouldn't have so much great horror and fantasy literature that we do today, and we wouldn't have a Cosmic Shenanigans. We wouldn't have Shenanigans of cosmic proportions to get up to. So that is our retrospective and our appreciation of Weird Tales over the last, math is not my strong suit, I'm guessing about 90 years. And I'm really proud to sort of be a part of that contribution to the fiction that Weird Tales had an absolute hand in establishing. So that is our show for this week. If you enjoyed Cosmic Shenanigans, we will be taking next week off. That's the week of Christmas, but we will be back the week of the 29th with a final episode of the year. It will be a reading from the cosmic horror master himself, H.P. Lovecraft, and I will read you a story, and that will be it for 2018. So I really hope you've enjoyed Cosmic Shenanigans, and that you'll join us for our final episode, and that I appreciate your support this year in listening to the podcast. So if you do enjoy Cosmic Shenanigans, you might also enjoy another show I co-host. That's The Horror Show with Brian Keene. Both of them are available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and now on YouTube, and all other platforms via the Project Entertainment Network. Also, as always, thank you to engineer Dave Thomas, who cleans me up and makes me sound nice. And you can watch his channel most nights at twitch.tv/meteornotes. Thanks for listening. Bye.
May I have your attention for the morning announcements? Please be advised the Lunch Ladies Book Club is coming to Project Entertainment Network. Join Shelley, Mimsy, and Ashley as they dish out a deep review of a book. Horror. Thrillers. Whatever they want to read and review. A blonde, a brunette, and a redhead walk into a bookstore and they're serving up hot book reviews. The Lunch Ladies Book Club? Coming soon. Exclusively on Project Entertainment Network. Would you now stand for the national anthem?
Don't get your lunch money stolen!